Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Ms. Eileen Vadreen, the Department of the Air Force Chief Data Officer, I just want to welcome everyone to the October Innovation Connect. Last month, we were lucky enough to have presentations from DARPA and the MIT AI Accelerator, and this month we are equally excited to have two exceptional presenters here with us today. So first, Mr. Dovarius L, the CIO of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Lieutenant Colonel Aneel Alvares, the Director of DIU in Boston. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mick McDaniel, the Deputy Chief Data Officer here for the Department of the Air Force. And again, just thank everyone for joining us today. This is still a new forum, but we think it's an important one, and we think it's one that that can really grow some ideas. One of the assumptions that we operate under is that innovation really requires the exchange of ideas, and that's what today is about. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have two exceptional presenters with us today to share ideas. So I encourage you, if you're dialing in, please don't be afraid to roger up and ask a question or offer an insight. I think that would be a great thing. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. As Callie mentioned, please just make sure everyone's on mute. And then if you don't mind, stop your video just to avoid extra distractions. The presenters will present, and then feel free while presenting to go ahead and post your questions into chat. If you're dialing in, save your questions for the end, but Ms. Lindsay Mask will moderate questions after each presentation. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter. Mr. Dovarius L has been part of the Senior Executive Service in the Department of the Army since January 2016. Right now, as I mentioned, he's serving as the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and has been in that position since April of 2019. In that role, he serves as the Principal Advisor to the Commanding General on information technology issues and is responsible for all aspects of information resource management and information technology for the Corps of Engineers. Before that assignment, Mr. Peoples was the Deputy to the Commanding General at U.S. Army NetCom. And without further ado, Mr. Peoples, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen here to pull up the presentation. Great. Okay, so I hope everyone can see that. So again, thank you for the opportunity. It's always good to be able to share good ideas amongst the communities of practice. So as we go through this, a little bit about the Army Corps of Engineers. So within the Army Corps of Engineers, we are about 33,000 civilian individuals strong, and about 700 military. We are made up of 9 divisions throughout the United States and 55 districts spread out throughout various states within the country. We have 3 major lines of effort. We support the military construction throughout the various camp posts and stations as an Army executive agent. We have a major civil works component, ensuring that the levees, locks, dams, waterways are secure. Most recent, we're notable for assisting with the alternate care facilities as we support the COVID-19 efforts. And then there's a disaster relief component, which we assist when it comes to different critical events and natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, and many of those other type of things. And we do have even several additional lines of effort from the research and development under the ERDIC, which is the Enterprise Research Development Center for the Department of the Army. We assist them, as well as the geospatial component as well. And then underlining where we come into play is the IT component. Under CIOG 6, we have the responsibility of ensuring that from a technical implementation and execution of capabilities, we oversee those in conjunction with the policy aspect, ensuring that the resource management, that the people aspects are also taken care of. So a pretty large, diverse mission scope. And again, on top of all of that, I'm pretty excited to be the CIO at the Army Corps of Engineers, as well to support the civil aspects, which support you all at the local and regional level as well, wherever you may be. So moving right along from an IT perspective, we have a huge mission to support. And as you know, COVID-19 has forced us to think about how we deliver IT services in a different manner. We like to use the term the new now versus the new norm. because even in the new now, we continue to have to change every day. There's nothing really constant. And as we evolve as a nation, as we evolve as IT professionals providing support to our various missions, roles, and responsibilities, we have to be able to change and we have to be flexible. So with that being said, we refuse to use the term new normal. We use the term new now. So one of the things that we've done as we support the COVID-19 efforts, just a few data points for us, we on an average day-to-day, we had about maybe 600 to 700 people logging into our VPNs. Once COVID-19 happened, we had to aggressively rush to expand our VPN capacity. So in about 4 or 5 days, we actually expanded that capacity to about 80,000, which was pretty significant, only to start off remote work with a fiber cut. So the first day of remote work, we were down for about 12 hours. So that also forced us to start thinking about how do we innovate and how do we provide services in a different manner, hence some of our modernization efforts that we'll begin to go deeper into. But let's take a minute and dive deep into our mission as an Army Corps of Engineers, being that we are a construction element, a construction agent for the Department of Defense. When you think about the breadth of the organization and you think about Fortune 500 companies, we're about ranked probably about 90 to 100 inside of the scope of our business line. So that's in the Fortune 500 world, that's pretty big. We're about a $40 to $50 billion industry. And as a part of building, we have various things that we focus on from an IT perspective to help us out in the construction and civil world. So our major efforts are to strengthen the foundation, to achieve the vision, as well as to deliver on the program. And in order to do those various things and be that engineering service provider, developing solutions for the nation's toughest challenges, we have to be able to operate and defend from an IT perspective in an efficient manner. So what does that mean? Ensuring that we operate with security as a focus, ensuring that we can defend and provide reliable comms. And as always, in order to achieve the vision, we have to be able to innovate. That means being responsive to various things from the architecture perspective to the services in which it is we provide, with keeping the end user in mind. And our end users are spread out in so many places at the distant end, whether they're in the fields, whether they're at a construction site, whether they're at the levees, the locks, dams, and those type of things. We have to provide technology to put into the hands of those end users in so many ways. So we pride ourselves on being the customer service provider of choice by delivering on the program and doing that in an excellent manner. So as we dive deeper into the IT, when I first came to the Corps, we developed a strategic roadmap, because you can't go anywhere without that roadmap. And as we went through the COVID-19 efforts, those efforts only accelerated. It pulled some of those things that were to the right, it pulled them to the left a lot more aggressively. So some of the areas that we begin to put focus on, we're trying to provide an enterprise level for service. So what does that mean? Being able to ensure that we receive and work great with a vendor that provides a service, but it allows the government to be more of an overseer of those capabilities versus turning the wrenches. That also allows us to be able to focus on many different things, but also be able to meet the intent from our customers that they're providing to us. So we put focus in 7 different mission areas. One of those is our network performance, cybersecurity, the compute aspects of things, application and software, the end user experience, and the governance. And ultimately, we're on that road to software as a service. There are many different things from a cloud, from how you can procure services and operate as an organization, platform, infrastructure, but we're trying to be more of a software as a service organization. That actually allows us to operate a lot more efficiently. It also allows us to divest in other capabilities in which it is that we may not need at the time. And it allows us to free up our professionals to be able to do other things, especially from a federal side of the house, because there are a lot of things that we can begin to get our hands involved in. And on top of that, everything is built on a governance foundation, because without the right governance principles, then at the end of the day, the organization doesn't run efficiently. We don't try to put too stringent of governance controls in place, but allow for the flexibility of the organization. But we do try to establish those checks and balances to ensure that we understand what's going on from a fiscal, from a FTAR perspective, which is the Federal IT Regulation Act that OMB has signed into law. So those are how we govern ourselves, because within the Corps we have a unique mission. We have a DOD mission, and then on top of that we have the civil OMB federal mission as well. So it's unique times in the Corps, it's fun times in the Corps, and throughout the rest of the presentation we'll begin to dive deep into some of the things that we're doing and how we see the world to kind of enable IT as well as innovation. So a lot of times people use this term new normal, as we've said, but we've modernized our term now to be the new now. And as a part of our IT modernization journey, we are on that road to true digital transformation. The main goal within the core, especially for FY21, is to untether the end user from their desktop and to enhance our mobile, the use of mobility. Being that the core is logged into, we are spread out so far. And like I said, we're in many different construction sites and those type of things. So one of the things that we're working to do now is to ensure that we can take full advantage of all the things that IT provides, whether that's mobility, the use of an iPad, the use of an iPhone, the use of certain concepts such as VDI and many other things. But the goal is to empower the true end user, and that's what we're doing. And from some of those things, we've set the bubble in place to where strong governance will enable us to begin to do a lot of things. And within the core, we look at things from the perspective of data versus systems, because ultimately you can identify and call a system many different things at the end of the day, but ultimately it's what data does users have a requirement to access. And within the Army Corps of Engineers, we have many different lines of effort, and there are many different IT capabilities that we're beginning to take advantage of to move our missions forward. One of the things that we're looking at now is how does 5G really enhance our mission elements, providing connectivity to those true end users in those distant field sites where connectivity is poor from working with our various service providers from an AT&T as well as from that of Verizon to help us move some of our mission elements forward. We're also beginning to take a look at concepts such as zero trust. How does zero trust allow us to effectively operate and externally collaborate? Zero trust is just a philosophy, but we're looking to figure out how can we operationalize a philosophy. So understanding that it's 70-80% conceptual and then looking at the ability to be able to deploy it. So with that being said, we've deployed a lot of mission critical capabilities, especially as we've navigated through the COVID-19 remote work. Some of the things we've done inside of the core is we've leveraged the Microsoft Teams, which DoD calls it CVR. We leverage that capability. We also have the ability through in an IL5 environment, which is a cloud environment, the O365 Microsoft environment. Our users have the ability to access their Outlook Web Access, OWA, email capability without having to log in through the VPN. Our goal within the core is to reduce the dependency of the VPN, but to enhance the ability to connect through using a web browser. That will allow us to be able to divest in many different areas. And it'll also allow our distant users who may not have CACs and PIVs to be able to actually credential into the environment in a safe manner, as well as to access a lot of the mission-critical applications without having to log in to the VPN. And ultimately, it's all about accessing the data. So one of the things that we're really trying to do is ensure that data and mission collaboration is always at an all-time high. So last slide here, but I think this is probably the most important slide of them all. Within the Army, within the Department of the Army, the Secretary of the Army has put out a memo as well as an exhort that we are to be a data-driven organization. And in order to be a data-driven organization, there are a lot of things that we had to begin to put in place. We had to begin to first think differently as an organization with regards to how we see ourselves and the various things that we assess. So in order to really get after the data-driven model, we had to take a step back and walk through a few things. So if I was to build a slide from the bottom up to really give you a good understanding of some of the things we're doing as it's centered around data, to really help you understand what we're trying to get after. So we've begun to look at data from an information repository perspective, meaning identifying the various aspects of data that our users really need access to versus the systems that we have, which prevents us from being married to a system. So from the core, some of our major business lines, as I've stated before, we are a construction organization. So we provide a lot of construction resources and elements to the department as well as to our civil community. So also understanding that we do a lot of financial transactions. We pay a lot of bills. We're a $60 billion industry organization. So with that being said, there are a lot of financial obligations that we have. On top of that, we manage a lot of projects. So looking at it from a project management perspective, as well as real estate. We are the real estate agent for the Department of Army as it pertains to many things. So those are some of our critical mission lines. And with that being said, users have a critical dependency upon that data. So looking at it from an authoritative data sources, those are the repositories that we have identified. and understanding there has to be a layer of security that allows us to be able to properly interact as well as to share this data. We begin to properly secure that, looking at it from our data dictionaries, our data catalog, enterprise services, and ETL transport-like tools to ensure proper DevSecOps capabilities are also applied within our concepts. And ultimately, our goal, as we've said, is to allow our end users to effectively access mission-critical data to be able to make authoritative decisions and access that in a secure manner. Because ultimately, if users don't have access to the data, then at the end of the day, we haven't done our job to empower them to be successful as they most possibly can. So from a core standpoint, we've set out to deploy what we call the Enterprise Virtual Viewer, and this virtual viewer will allow us to be able to display information in one central repository. We break it into three aspects. The first component is the platform, looking at it from a cloud infrastructure perspective, which will allow us to be able to operate in an efficient manner. Then we begin to move up to the next level with regards to the visualization component. The visualization component will allow end users to be able to access that data, be able to visualize it, conceptualize it, and be able to make sense of it. And then we have the third component, which is the data management capability. That data management capability will allow us to access data real time. It'll also ensure that the data quality aspect of our data is intact. And then it'll continue to allow us to be able to share and assess ourselves. So those are the three aspects or three components in which it is that we've broken our data aspects into. And based off of that, that is our Enterprise Virtual Viewer to bring our entire ecosystem together and allow us to be able to make authoritative decisions within the core, because we are 2/3 of a data-driven organization, and ultimately we want to be 100%. And in order to do that effectively, those are some of the foundational blocking and tackling efforts and initiatives that we've set out within FY21 to overcome. So I'll pause there and open the discussion up to have good, fruitful discussion between professionals, and that will end the actual PowerPoint portion of the brief, just to give you a good rundown of some of the things we have going on within the core. And that is all I have. Subject to questions, comments, and concerns, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. This is Lindsay with the Chief Data Office, and we do have a few questions. And we want to remind people that if you do have a question, you can just enter it into the chat, and we'll pull it and make sure that they get addressed. So the first question was, is there a DoD Innovation Ecosystem map? And I will just mention that some information has already been provided in the chat, but I wanted to also offer that question to you, Mr. Peoples.
You said a DoD mapping?
Innovation Ecosystem map.
Yeah, so DoD, I believe, is actually working on those, especially based off the direction of the DoD CIO. So a lot of that is in the works now. And as we look at it from a broader perspective, our goal, especially from an Army standpoint, is how do we map into the larger aspects of that ecosystem. So I believe that from a SVOV perspective, DoD is working to show that ecosystem. And from an Army perspective, we are identifying how we tie into that. So I think those efforts are ongoing because this concept of data is fairly new to many. So being able to understand what it really entails, I think everybody's trying to get after that data concept. And as you know, DoD did put out their data strategy, which was signed here into the works not too long ago. So as an entire organization, we all are working to plug ourselves or integrate ourselves into that larger strategy.
Okay, and this is sort of a tie-in. Is there a map that shows how the AppWorks and Spark Cell type organizations can or already have connected, not just what orgs exist?
So if there is one at this point, I haven't seen it because you know the DoD landscape is so broad. I can speak from an Army perspective. The Army has actually started to identify those. We've been working with the Chief Data Officer at the higher headquarters level in the CIO office, and as well as our Enterprise Cloud Management Office, working with Mr. Paul Puckett, who's also beginning to move the charge forward with some of the cloud elements. So all of those play in hand. So from an Army perspective and a data aspect, yes, we have begun to show those various inject points and integrated pieces. So I can speak for the Army, and as far as DoD, I believe DoD is probably on that same course, but we're just providing our input into DoD.
Okay, I believe our next speaker might be able to also offer some insight on that when we hear his presentation and afterwards. Next question is, does or how does the Army Corps of Engineer innovators in the Department of the Army using or have any approved tools like end user interactions during VTC and virtual meetings connect or tie into the other DoD innovators or innovation groups? So approved tools like Mural or Miro that allow end user interactions during VTC and virtual meetings connect or tie in to the other DoD innovators or innovation groups. It's a two-part question.
Right. So we've been leveraging to a certain extent CVR. CVR, which as we know is the DoD version of Microsoft Teams, which allows us to have some aspects of mission collaboration and those type of things. We've also been in conversations with actually we just took a brief presentation yesterday with one of our mission partners, being out of Cisco, on looking at the WebEx capability that has virtual reality. And what that does is it allows you to be able to see the entire landscape of your virtual meeting, to include all the way down to the end users at distant areas, and it brings many together. So how can we bring virtual reality into the meeting concept, because we all are in so many different locations. So why is that important from a Corps standpoint, and the Army Corps of Engineers, as we develop from a construction standpoint at these different sites, and able to have in order to have construction engineers at these sites, it brings everyone together from a virtual standpoint, which enhances collaboration, because now you can begin to have the opportunity to see things at the schematic level or what an individual has in their hands, which sometimes it may not always be that case when you begin to look at it from just a video capability. So we're trying to move the ball forward from a virtual reality standpoint to enhance mission collaboration as an end user. Currently, right now, we are using, to answer the first part of the question, we are using the commercial virtual remote environment, CVR, which is allowing us to talk throughout DoD with other components as well to enhance that collaboration aspect. So we have some things going on currently right now, and we also have some things going on that we're looking to future to get us over the hump a little bit more, so we can effectively collaborate amongst all within the department.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question is, data has grown up in disconnected silos of excellence. How is your agency working towards identifying all your data sources, and what challenges have you come up against mapping data to mission sets?
Yeah, so we've spent, I'll say we've probably spent the last I've been at the Corps for about almost 2 years, almost now, and we have spent probably the last, I'm going to say at least 8 months trying to identify authoritative data sources and developing accurate data dictionaries. And that has been a challenge. The reason being is because as many organizations, we have operated in silos. We have looked at things from the perspective of systems versus looking at it from data. So that has been a huge challenge. One of the things we have done, we've kept an accurate account of our systems. However, we haven't kept an accurate list of the system integrated components or the data dependencies. So being able to map that data architecture with data engineers has really been the challenge, because, again, a data scientist isn't a data engineer. So being able to get the right talent on board to help us get through this, that has been a huge challenge for us. And we've started to turn the corner now. We begin to work with several industry partners to help us map out our AIS modernization journey, to begin to identify not just authoritative sources, but to identify where systems reside, and also to work to identify what data elements do our customers need to access in order to be efficient in their job. So we've seen many challenges, but our goal is to reduce the amount of systems. So we've set up a data governance board, and a data governance council. The data governance board meets, I think it's monthly, and the data governance council meets weekly. And what do we achieve by that? It begins to allow us to pull in our various organizations and look at things from the context of data, which now we're starting to prevent us from developing multiple systems to do the same thing, but allowing us to look at what data elements are needed. So that started our divestment journey as well, and that means making some hard decisions because, as we know as professionals, it's hard to get rid of things that we've been wedded to for so long as professionals and begin to see things differently. So we've ran into the people challenge, we've ran into the culture challenge, and we've also ran into the system challenge. So all of those things we've been working to overcome. We started to turn that corner in order to really identify those type of concepts. Still have a ways to go, but the journey has started and the fun times have begun. So we're enjoying the ride that we're on right now, and we're starting to make a lot of progress.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, so that's good. Does the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have initiatives towards implementing AI and machine learning? And the second part is, can you share the strategy and approach?
Yeah, so we've set up, working with the Enterprise Research Development Center, ERDIC, we call it ERDIC. We've set up, working with ERDIC, various working groups to get after the AI aspects of things. Because, you know, AI is another modernization capability that if not done right, then, you know, you can run into issues further down the road. So we have begun to look at it from the perspective of training. The goal for the Corps is to train our professionals in a way to where they can understand how to properly deploy a lot of these capabilities. So we begin to work with the likes of, whether that's, we've taken conversations with Tableau, just to name a few. We've also been working with Microsoft inside of the O365 environment. There are many different capabilities that we're beginning to look at from an AI perspective, but we're trying now to operationalize it. We're a huge water organization, which is one of the water missions is a critical one. Hydropower is another critical mission that we have inside of the Corps, and all of these, to include construction and project management, all of these organizations and lines of effort have some dependency on AI to streamline and make their mission more effective. So we begin to take some of these various use cases and working with a lot of our industry partners, trying to figure out how do we operationalize a concept such as AI. Fairly new, but there are a lot of benefits into AI. So over the course of FY21, we baked into some of those concepts into our budget, which will allow us to be able to effectively get after the testing, because ERDIC does a great job in doing the research. So now we figure out how we take research and then we operationalize it. And from a CIOG6 standpoint, our goal is to ensure that the organization continues to run effectively from an IT perspective. So we're beginning to dive deep into the AI machine learning concepts. It's broad in nature, and there's really no true guidance as to how to get after it. But we have been working internally as well as even externally at the DoD CIO and the Big Army CIOG6 level to ensure that we're nested with all and that we're getting after the right things.
Okay, and I'm just going to let you know that some of the comments that are coming in are for offline and that we will share with you separately so that you can have private conversations with some of the folks. But the next question is the environment described leveraging Advana, or was the cloud environment described Army-specific capability?
No, so the way we build our platforms capability agnostic. We don't try to lock ourselves into a specific capability. So as you know, identifying a lot of the data repositories and those type of things, that's really internal to the organization to map those out. We are, as of right now, we just put out an RFI to identify the visualization, the technical platform that we'll use for the visualization component, because, again, we're capability agnostic when it comes to tools. We're really just looking at the data. So we've been through the app rationalization piece because, as you know, for visualization and data, you can visualize it using many different tools, whether that's Power BI, whether that's Tableau, whether that's Click. You name it, there are many out there. And at the end of the day, our main goal was to identify the right data repositories. So we let the requirements and the data drive the requirements, data, and the processes, because you can't forget about those, drive what the technical solution is. So we're in the process now of going through the RFI phase. Soon we'll be going to RFP to procure a tool to get us there. But we built this based off of the requirements and the repositories and looking at the end solution as something that is really at the end. So it's capability agnostic. Right now it's not running on a, quote, technical platform, but we are working to procure a tool to get to that point.
Okay, we have comments about what a great presentation this is, followed with a question. One concern I heard from your presentation was what sounded on reliance on cell coverage, such as AT&T, et cetera. To be able to communicate with an extremely large organization, end users, deployed forces, et cetera. Has the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers looked at commercial satellite voice data communication solutions for many of the same missions that the commercial world has? Specifically, multi-mode satellite and cellular redundancy when cellular isn't available due to natural disasters, areas with no cell coverage, and the like.
Yeah, we work with, so AT&T using FirstNet is one of our major service providers when it pertains to like disaster relief and those type of things. So we are taking full advantage of the capabilities that industry provides to us, especially with the uniqueness of our disaster recovery, disaster relief mission. That mission area forces us to take advantage of the majority of commercial related products and capabilities. So we definitely are, we're joined with those guys, not just with AT&T and Verizon. We have a diverse subset, because as you know, depending on where you go in the nation, many different providers will provide you excellent service. So we have to be, again, capability or vendor agnostic, but driving on a requirement. So when you look at places such as Montana, Walla Walla in the northwestern area, those areas don't have good coverage, and some of your main providers that you know of just don't provide good service because there is limited resources there. So we've worked with many providers to really enhance that. Another good example, as you know, right now, currently as we speak, in the southern region area, we're going through the disaster relief aspects now with hurricanes and floods and those type of things. So we've actually begun to prep the deployment of some of these capabilities to ensure that once everything boils over, we can stand up these satellite locations or satellite trucks empowered with some of the most strongest of cell coverage and mission connectivity to ensure that we can reach out. Because one of the things that's unique about the Corps, we actually participate in many different relief missions, and one of those was the Blue Tarp mission on top of roofs. Contrary to popular belief, that was more of a communication capability or communication resource that was able to enhance the speedy deployment of those Blue Tarp missions. So we actually are looking at many, and wherever we can find diversity in our offerings and our solutions, that's what we're looking to do.
Okay, great. And the next question is, what Corps' utilization of 3D mapping, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say this wrong, but it was LIDAR data, does it fall into the Corps strategy for FY 2021?
Right now, we haven't dove that deep into it because, again, that same functionality can be achieved in looking at it from many different ways. So looking at that specific area, that's just one way with the LIDR. But we believe that we can build that type of service and capability using some of the things that we have. So we are looking at resources and capabilities to enhance that aspect of the mission. But as of right now, we haven't specifically called out too many new modernization efforts to get after some of those components because we're trying to enhance some of the things that we're currently doing. I mean, that's just from a core standpoint right now. Not saying that it's off the table, but looking at the 5-meter target right now, it's not within the scope of modernization for FY21.
Okay. And what is the Corps' approach to implement the new DoD data strategy for data-centric security?
So we've actually started working on that, and we're leveraging the DevSecOps component to be able to enhance security. And we're also looking at Zero Trust in order to be able to do that. We've actually started working inside of the O365 environment to deploy the Zero Trust methodology because, again, it's a methodology and we're trying to operationalize it. We haven't solved it all the way, but we are breaking it into pieces, looking at it from a data access standpoint, data management, user credentialing aspect as well. And all of those things yield into the data management world. Because ultimately, how do we protect our environment, ICAM, IDAM aspect, to prevent unauthorized users from being able to access the data elements? So we're beginning to figure out how do we securely deploy Zero Trust to especially our O365 environment where users access mission-critical capabilities like email, SharePoint, OneDrive, OneNote, and of course, Microsoft Teams. So we are actively working that deployment, and we're working in conjunction with headquarters, Army, as well as the DoD CIO's office to properly implement, deploy, as well as conceptualize some of these capabilities and various aspects as we move forward. But definitely DevSecOps, which is the secure transmission of data and those type of things. We're looking at various tools and capabilities from an ETL perspective to enhance some of those same data concepts. So it's ongoing now, and a lot of it is moving pretty quickly.
Okay. Right now I have 2 more questions unless any others come in. The next one is, do you have any documents that show how you have accomplished some of these efforts that we can use as new stand-up efforts, perhaps using something that's already proven to work?
Yeah, so the way we work within the core, we use this term I like to call micro strategies, right? Because the micro strategies actually allow us to identify the objective in conjunction with the activities that's also associated with it. So we begin to put all of those things together and be able to move forward.
I apologize. I just want to ask our participants to mute if they could, please. I apologize for that. Thank you.
Yeah. So we can share some of those documents where applicable. Just reach out to us. But we do use the microstrategy concept. So we've done a lot of analysis on a lot of our efforts and initiatives going forward, and we've broken our strategies into microstrategies as well as sub-microstrategies to allow us to understand the activities that's required, the objectives and outcomes to include the vision of where we're going. So we don't mind sharing those where applicable to kind of enhance collaboration amongst other organizations. I mean, I know we've been working, good example, with the deployment of O365 with Army, Navy, DISA, and the likes, because ultimately it will require community collaboration in order to effectively implement. So we've been sharing a lot of the lessons learned with the rest of the community as well with regards to how to properly deploy Microsoft O365 in an IL5 environment. So that's just one example, but we don't mind sharing, and wherever we can do that, we'll definitely do that. Over.
Thank you. And the last question that I have now is, one of the main challenges of changing mission software to accomplish what you have laid out for the future is software and hardware approval. Have you figured out a way to speed up the acceptance and approval process?
Yeah, so one of the things we do, we receive service. It goes back to our enterprise IT as a service concept, or our enterprise services concept. We receive a lot of these services from a vendor. So it goes back as to how you procure some of the services to kind of speed up some of these things. We use the Army chest vehicles. We also use some of the NASA suit vehicles that allows us to purchase hardware and software. But one of the things we've seen is allowing the vendor through a hardware, software, ODC type claims on contract vehicles to have the ability to purchase some of these pieces of software where applicable in an expedient manner on the behalf of the organization. Because that actually speeds up time versus having to wait 6-8 months just to procure hardware, software. You can procure those pretty rapidly with a turnaround time of like 7 to 10 days or less, depending on how much and what that requirement is. So we begin to strategically look at some of the ways where we can enhance that turnaround time and delivery time, but definitely baking those concepts into a services type vehicle to where you can have individuals to be able to procure that, vendors to procure that on your behalf, especially as an integrator, because we use an integrator within the Corps of Engineers to provide us those type of services. So allowing an integrator to have those type of resources available to them to procure some of those type of things readily available actually enhances a lot of the things in which it is that we do, as well as from a mission procurement perspective, even though we still have the ability to procure off of the NASA suit vehicles and, as I said, the Army chest and some of those other various DOD, GSA type vehicles that are out there.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Peoples, and thanks, Lindsay, for moderating those questions. So Again, Mr. Peoples, hey, thank you very much for joining us today. Fascinating presentation, and it's really, really cool to see all of the things that are going on over in the Corps of Engineers. Particularly the micro strategies was of interest to us, so I think that's a great approach and a really good way to do things. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. If we get other questions in the chat, we'll make sure that we get those to you and then facilitate a follow-up. So thank you very much again. And on behalf of Ms. Vadrine, our boss, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. So thank you, sir.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, our next presenter, as I had mentioned at the beginning, is coming to us from DIU Boston. So Colonel Alvares, he's the Air Force the Air Force Service Advisor, as well as the Director of Defense Innovation Unit Boston. So he's got an extensive operational military background that he brings to that job, including experience as a B-1 pilot, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, and operational test and evaluation professional. Lots of combat time and lots of great experience. And he's now bringing that to the innovation world, where he's working to frame new projects and matching DoD problems with commercial solutions, while also working to engage the greater Boston and East Coast innovation ecosystems. So Lieutenant Colonel Aneel Cramden Alvares, hey, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
I really appreciate that intro and for giving us the opportunity to present here, and to the audience, thanks for taking the time to listen to what we have to say. Let's bring up the slides here in a second. All right, it looks like that's showing up. All right, so what I'd like to go over in the next 20 minutes or so is an overview of how DIU came to be, our processes, and the impact that we think we're having on the DoD. I'll run through a few examples of projects that we've run and are continuing to run, and then hopefully we'll have 10 or 20 minutes for Q&A as well. So starting out with DIU's history, it began in the middle of the last decade. You had Secretary of Defense Ash Carter at the time looking at some global trends. So starting out with the right side of this screen, he was looking at the federal R&D budget as represented by the red line going back to around the beginning of the Cold War to the time when he was looking at this data. And the blue line represents aggregated commercial sector R&D in the U.S. over that same time period. And I'm sorry if I said that incorrectly. The red line is aggregated federal R&D spending. The blue line's aggregated commercial sector R&D spending. And you see till about the end of the Cold War, those lines more or less moved in lockstep. But the peace dividend that came with the end of the Cold War meant that the federal government didn't have to spend quite as much on R&D, and so at least temporarily, that red line tapered off, whereas the blue line continued its exponential rise. So much so that you get over to the left side of the screen, by 2018, you look at the total R&D spending of 5 of the top firms in the traditional defense industrial base that year spent a total of $6.2 billion on R&D, whereas 5 of the top firms out in Silicon Valley spent 11 times that amount in that same year. Take that one step further, the R&D spending by the primes is almost entirely taxpayer funded, whereas R&D spending by those Silicon Valley firms is almost entirely funded by investors and venture capitalists and from current operations. And so, this data isn't meant to imply that Secretary Carter was looking to Facebook to build the next aircraft carrier, but he did look at these trends and say, look, there's a ton of R&D being spent out there in the commercial sector. How can we leverage it? The other global trends that he was seeing was that these countries we used to call our near-peer competitors, like China and Russia, all of a sudden we found us dropping the near and we're just calling them peer competitors, especially in a few tech areas like AI, hypersonics, and a few others where they were out-competing us even at that point. And so Secretary Carter was looking for a way to leverage R&D spending that was being spent in the commercial sector that produces or that yielded products that could be quickly modified to solve tough defense challenges. And so what he came up with was DIU-X, the X being experimental. So Defense Innovation Unit experimental at that time. And he gave us the charter that you see here on this slide that's been more or less the same ever since, and that is to accelerate the DoD adoption of commercial technologies, in doing so, transform military capabilities. And then as implied on the last slide, what he one of the things he really wanted to do was to expand that national security innovation base, to get the DoD away from just thinking of working with the primes, and more importantly, to get the thousands and thousands of small organizations out there, small companies out there that would never think about doing business with the federal government or the DoD, to make it easy for them to do business with the DoD and to get them excited about doing business with the DoD. And so that's more or less remained our charter for our 5 years of existence. Now, the method by which we get at that mission, I'll jump to on the next slide, the tech areas that we focus on and that we focused on for most of our 5 years are up on the screen here. The very first one we just added this month. These are our portfolio areas, and that's how we organize within DIU. The first of those areas, advanced energy and materials, again, we just added this month. The rest have been around for a lot longer: AI, machine learning, autonomy, cyber, human systems, and space. All right, so as mentioned, this is the how of what we do, and I'd like to spend the most time on this slide because I think it is the core of what we do. So what we do starts with that first block, problem curation, and I think that's probably the biggest difference between how we do what we do and how the traditional defense acquisition system does what it does. So and you heard my background. I had no acquisition experience before coming to DIU, so a lot of this was news to me as of 2.5 years ago, as far as how the traditional defense acquisition system works. But the norm is for us to identify a problem, for us to work a problem in a DoD lab or similar type organization, to come up with some solutions, try to find the best one in-house, come up with a set of requirements, and then put those requirements out to industry to bid on scaling that solution. And my take is that's an absolutely appropriate methodology for a lot of DoD problems, especially when there's not a commercial sector solution out there. But given our charter to focus on problems where there is a commercial sector solution, our process is significantly different in that we stop at the problem phase. Okay, so when we work with a DoD customer, that DoD partner approaches us with a problem, with funds to do the prototyping of that problem, and funds or a plan to get funds to transition that capability. Now, what happens more often than not is that partner comes to us with requirements because that's how we're used to thinking of the DoD. And so we try to take a step back and say, all right, well, what's the core problem that we're trying to solve here? All right. And at the end of this process, the problem curation phase, we want to come up with a problem statement that can be as short as one sentence, but typically is 4 or 5 paragraphs. Okay. Now, I want to compare that with when I first came to DIU, I looked at websites like FedBizOps and now SAM.gov. I'd been in government for about 20 years at that point, and I was still a little bit taken aback as to how many PDFs, how many pages of requirements and instructions there were to companies on how to submit for a traditional FAR-based solicitation. I think of a lot of the organizations we work with that are 5 to 10 people. They don't have contracting departments, and they just don't have the capacity to go through hundreds of pages of solicitation documentation. And that was likely one of the barriers as to why the National Security Innovation Base had shrunk down to a set of organizations that could afford to have contracting departments to figure out the FAR-based acquisition process. All right. So after we get through this problem curation phase, we come up with a problem statement. It then goes over to our defense engagement team and our commercial engagement team. I'm a member of the latter. So our commercial engagement team is going to go out there with this problem statement into the market and try to figure out if there are actually companies out there that could potentially solve this problem with the technologies that they have on offer. Then they'll take it a step further and get into the financials of each one of those companies and make sure they're viable enough to make it through a prototyping and production phase. They'll take it even one step further. They'll work with their counterintelligence folks and try to figure out where does the investment for these companies come from? Are there any shady characters? To be blunt about things, if a Chinese state-owned enterprise was the major stakeholder in a company that we're potentially looking to do business with, that would, of course, be a red flag. And so that's the type of thing that they're looking for. Our defense engagement team, what I do most of the time is when we're facing a DoD problem, I try to figure out who else in the DoD or the interagency might have that same problem and might be willing to pool funds to create a prototype, thus saving everybody funds and money to get to the same solution collaboratively. Additionally, we'll work with a primary partner to try to come up with a sound plan to make sure there's funding in place that at the end of the prototype period, we can go directly to production. More on that in a moment, but we try to work as much of this in parallel because when you work these different phases in series, in the traditional acquisition process, that's kind of what drives your average of about 8 years to field a technology. And we're looking to do so in 2 to 3 years. All right, so after we get through problem curation, we come up with that problem statement. It checks out in the market that there are actually viable companies out there that can potentially solve this problem or that have a technology we can modify over a short prototyping period to solve this problem. We line up other potential defense or agency partners. Then we get into the meat of the DIU process that we call the commercial solutions opening. So this is an other transactions-based process. If you have questions about OTs, I'd be happy to answer the little I know about them during the Q&A period. But it's an other transactions-based process that is distinctly different from FAR-based acquisition. And it starts out with our area of interest statement. So that's when we take our problem statement and we put it on our website for just 2 weeks. Then a lot of the companies that our commercial engagement team has contacted or other companies in our network will have an opportunity to submit a solutions brief. And this is a very simple, plain English submission, 5-page white paper, 10 to 15 slide deck, explaining to us how they propose to solve this problem. You don't have to, you don't need any kind of expertise except for your technical expertise to be able to submit a solutions brief in this phase. The number of submissions depends on the problem that we're dealing with, but it's probably ranged from as little as 6 if we're looking at a really niche, narrow problem and solution space, all the way up to, we recently hit a record of 111 submissions in our solicitation for AI for small unit maneuver. So after that 2-week period, we'll sit down with our DoD partner. If we don't have in-house expertise, or if our partner doesn't have in-house expertise to really understand the core of the technology, we'll put people from Lincoln Labs or Lawrence Livermore or NASA or wherever is needed on contract to sit down with us during this down select period to make sense of some of the solution briefs that have come in. And then we'll typically ask about 20 to 30% of the companies that submitted in that initial phase to come in or by PTC, do a follow-on pitch and Q&A session with their subject matter experts, our DoD partner, and the relevant DIU members. From there, we'll down select again. We'll typically put between 1 and 5 firms on contract to produce a prototype. That prototype period lasts normally from 12 to 18 months. And then if the prototype is successful by the rules of other transaction agreements, we can go directly to production without having to recompete because the original prototype was competitive. And that could be a production other transaction agreement, which is certainly the simplest way to go about things, or it can be a FAR-based production agreement as well. All right, so moving on to what we look for before starting a DIU project. So as mentioned, we want to make sure that there really are viable technologies and viable firms out there that could potentially solve the problem at hand. And our focus is on commercial because we want to stay true to our charter, and that is to spare the taxpayer from the costs of R&D for these solutions. So if we wind up working with a company that's entirely DoD or military focused, ultimately the DoD or the federal government wind up paying for the R&D for that solution, which is what we want to avoid. Okay, so we are squarely focused on commercial sector solutions. We also want to make sure it falls within one of the 6 portfolio categories that we mentioned, largely because that's the type of expertise that we hire for. All right. The third one, dedicated DoD partner, might sound snooty. It's not meant to be at all. I'll explain. We want to make sure that the DoD partner isn't looking to expend current year RDT&E funds on an experiment. And that's absolutely nothing against that. It's just not in the DIU charter to do experimentation, as our goal is modification of commercial sector technologies to transition them as fast as possible. And the way we go about that is, for one, we want to make sure the end user really considers this a critical problem that they need to solve. Necessity is the mother of invention. And if the user really needs this capability, they're going to pull the project across the finish line and get to transition. We also want to make sure there's acquisition organization buy-in. So in the vast majority of cases, we're going to be working with the PM and the PEO from the outset to make sure they're on board, especially if there's a logistics tail to the solution. They really have to be on board from the outset. We want to make sure they're on board, that they're willing to make a POM input, and they're willing to advocate for the success of that POM input. It doesn't have to be a POM input. Depending on the circumstances, there could be other ways to get funding to take a project to transition. But the bottom line is that we want to see a very clear path to transition before we start a project, because otherwise we wind up just doing experimentation. Again, that's perfectly appropriate for lots of organizations in the DoD, just not part of the DIU charter. And then lastly, we want to have, in as many cases as possible, some kind of headquarters level buy-in. So typically this winds up being general officer or flag officer, SES support for a project that helps push that POM input or helps push that funding that's needed to get that transition that we're looking for at the end of the day. All right, and then the transition plan, already mentioned most of this under the last heading, but that's really a key that I think DIU's learned through less success when we haven't focused on transition from the outset. The alternative is you wind up prototyping a capability, then that capability proves successful, then you make a POM input, but the POM cycle is 2 years, right? So if you do a solicitation now, the prototyping period, let's say it's 18 months, a year and a half, that proves successful, then you start working with the PEOs to make your POM input. 2 years later, you get transition funding. Now you're already up to maybe 4 years or so before you can think about transitioning capability, which is outside of the timelines within which DIU wants to work. And there is a very practical reason for wanting to stay within about 3 years or so to get a capability out to the field, and that is the upgrade timeframe of many technologies. The tech refresh cycle is very short, right? So if we're not fielding capabilities in 2 or 3 years, what we wind up fielding will already be outdated based on what's in the commercial sector today. I sometimes use the example, mentioned that it was a B-1 pilot a long time ago. And way back then, as a young co-pilot, I was duct taping GPS antennas to the cockpit window for a very finicky GPS on the $300 million B-1. So much so that some of our WIZOs, weapon systems officers, as they were called at that time anyway, would go out to Walmart and buy $99 Garmins. They were much more reliable than the GPS on the $300 million B-1. So that's what we want to avoid. We want to be inside those tech upgrade cycles that we're seeing in the commercial sector. And to do so, we have to work a lot of these acquisition processes in parallel instead of in series. All right, almost done here. So this is kind of the summary slide. I know we're called the Defense Innovation Unit, and at one time there was a little bit of in-house innovation that was done with respect to counter-UAS and small UAS. But the reality is we don't, for the most part, we don't do in-house innovation. We are brokers between priority Department of Defense problems and innovative solutions in the commercial sector. So for our DoD partners, there are a few particular things we offer. One is access to the commercial sector. When DIU was fairly new, DIUX, I guess at the time, we would hire people just for their connections in Silicon Valley and in Boston and to different venture capital firms to help build that network that the DoD just didn't have in the 2015 timeframe. And that network exists today, and it's thriving today, and our commercial engagement team keeps building that network every day. Okay? It's also a very collaborative process. The other transaction process, I liken it to if you want to put an addition on your home, you're going to work with a bunch of general contractors, evaluate their plan, come up with a contract, and then just sit down with that general contractor and figure out the statement of work, the terms of that contract in a very collaborative way. There's only been one GAO complaint that I know of involving DIU, and it was actually Oracle that made the complaint. But in every other circumstance, we're able to work out these minor issues in a very collaborative, common sense way that you don't always see in government. And I think a lot of that is because we mostly are working with small firms, medium-sized firms that are eager to build a name, that are eager to be seen as collaborative, and our DoD partners, of course, likewise are interested in getting a solution fast. They don't want to get bogged down in years of litigation. And so for the most part, we can work through problems in a way that yields sensible results. And that helps us deliver those capabilities, as you see on the screen, in under 24 months. And then lastly, as I'll talk about in some of the examples, we're typically able to deliver capabilities at much lower costs than might be achieved by traditional acquisition processes. All right, so for commercial firms, there are a few things we offer as well. One, as already alluded to, the vastly simpler process than you might see by other acquisition methodologies, and it tends to be far, far quicker as well. I didn't mention this, but our goal is to go from solicitation to prototype contract signing in 60 days. We're not there now. We're closer to 100 days, but working every day to try to get that number down to about 60 days. I did mention the highly negotiable contracts. we also offer a PM, not offer, but a PM runs each one of our projects, which is very helpful to commercial firms that aren't so familiar with the DoD. You have somebody there to explain everything, every step of the way, especially the contracting piece. That's sort of where we still have to interface with traditional DoD acquisition methods, which can be challenging for small firms. Again, if you're a 5 to 10 person firm, without a contracting department, having that PM there is a major resource. And then lastly, at the end of the prototype period, if your product is successful, there's the possibility for very lucrative contracts. Oops. All right, so I'm going to run through a few projects pretty quickly. I'll run through these. I'll just touch on the high points so we have more time for Q&A. Kind of randomly selected from across the portfolios, but rate rapid analysis of threat exposure was an interesting project to address the problem of mostly soldiers and Marines getting sick on the battlefield. We want to be able to predict that 48 to 72 hours ahead of time, so we can, of course, that would help operational effectiveness. Will also help the members not be out in a remote area when we know they're about to get sick. And the way this was done, we wound up partnering with Philips Healthcare on this. And they went through a few decades worth of human and non-human primate studies, mostly clinical type studies. They went through not the main point of the studies, but the data behind those studies to build a database that showed correlations, or that could potentially show correlations between early symptoms and negative clinical outcomes. So they built the database on their own and then applied machine learning algorithms to solidify those correlations so that they could look for those type of symptoms and try to get better and better at predicting when somebody's going to get sick 48 hours before they actually show, elevated temperature and outward symptoms. So we started this a couple of years ago, and then COVID hit, and this took on a whole new level of importance, and Philips Healthcare was able to pivot their data set to a COVID-specific data set. And so now this, just in the last few months, this project has blown up in a good way, where you have large-scale trials at the Pentagon. I think we're about to launch at the Naval Academy. Lots of other DoD organizations are wearing these wearables that feed into or that pull data from this database to try to predict when your personal symptoms are going to show a likelihood of that you'll pop hot on a COVID test. All right, moving on to, let's see what's next. AI for predictive maintenance. So, of course, this is in our AI portfolio. This is a project that is now expanded to all services, but started with the Air Force. As the name suggests, the goal is to predict parts failures before they actually happen. And so C3 IoT was the primary vendor here. They had to build a database to apply machine learning algorithms to before they could do so. And they did so with some not so great data. If you're familiar with flying, there's a 781 form that aircrew used to fill out. I think it's all digital now, but it used to be a paper form that you fill out with maintenance discrepancies. And so C3 IoT went through decades of 781s, scanned in 781s, and then used optical character recognition to build the database of maintenance problems and correlated that with different flight conditions and other maintenance conditions to try to predict when parts were likely to fail. Okay, contrast that with what the technical orders traditionally prescribed, and that was parts change-outs based on flight hours on an airframe or time compliance, right? So this is a much more nuanced way to be able to change parts, and you can thus change parts when your aircraft is in phase maintenance instead of trying to do it on the flight line when a jet's trying to take off and all of a sudden red lights or cockpit lights are going off showing parts failures and now your mission's late or ineffective. The initial trial was done with the E3 and C5, and they showed a 33%, or they were able to catch about 33 to 40%, I think the numbers were, of unscheduled maintenance on those airframes. And that increased slightly when they added the F-16 and now the F-35. As mentioned, this has been expanded to other services. So the Army's using this for Bradleys and expanding it to other vehicles. The Navy's looking to apply this on ships and submarines, but in reality, this is widely applicable to pretty much any machine that has maintenance records. So we're excited to see how this continues to scale. All right, sublaunched UAS, I'll just touch on this one really quickly. There are a few numbers there in bold that I want to point out. We didn't come up with the concept or facilitate the concept of a sublaunched UAS. So this is a UAS that gets launched out of a tube, it surfaces, and then when it hits the surface, wings pop out, flies above the surface, and provides surveillance video back to the boat. AeroVironment had been doing this for a number of years for PMS 425, the Navy Program Office that managed this contract. The user community wanted a longer range on the vehicle. AeroVironment quoted a pretty steep quote to make it happen. And so PMS 425 turned to DIU to see if there were any other options out there. We went through our CSO process and wound up contracting with the firms you see on the right. Alvares wound up producing a solution in under 18 months with a 50% range increase at 40% of the cost of the original vehicle, not even the inflated cost vehicle to increase the range. And I put this slide in here because the DIU tagline is better, faster, cheaper. I think this was a great example of exactly that. In fact, I went through those numbers when the Undersecretary of the Navy was visiting the DIU Boston office recently, and we were trying to make the case for more manpower. The interesting thing here, I think, is that there's a Navy 03 that ran this project from start to finish. And you look at the cost of putting that Navy 03 at DIU at Silicon Valley, so more expensive than most places, let's say $400,000 to $500,000. But he wound up saving the Navy tens of millions of dollars in the cost of these one-time use vehicles. It's a pretty high ROI. Again, in that particular instance, we're trying to convince the Navy to give us more sailors, but just in general, I think the better, faster, cheaper mantra holds pretty well. I think this is the last example I have, almost done. AATSN, Autonomous Airborne Teaming Sensor Network. Hopefully many of you have heard of Skyborg. It's sort of a subset to Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which is a hot topic now in all services. Many of you may have just recently seen the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and Chief of Staff of the Army recently had a handshake agreement on sharing data, sort of. We can talk more about that later, on JADC2, because the Army has Project Convergence, and the Navy is just starting Project Overmatch. And that's all the services contributions to JADC2. This project was one of the first major projects to be a part of Skyborg, which is more of the kinetic piece of the Air Force's ABMS contribution to JADC2. Sorry for all the acronyms. But this was a big success just this week, and an interesting example. So in line with the DIU process, this was a prototype other transaction agreement that just transitioned either this week or last week. Three of the firms on the right, Fregata, Kratos, and Lockheed, transitioned their capability under a traditional FAR-based contract with the Air Force to produce some of the baseline network capability for the Air Force's Skyborg program. So our goal, I don't know if it'll happen, but our goal is to keep building on this and keep contributing to each service's instance of JADC2. And I think DIU, not being within a service, is well placed to assist with the interoperability that's really needed in that system. All right, so we can spend more time on Q&A. I'll just summarize this slide as why DIU, think better, faster, cheaper, is applicable to almost every project we do and take on, and that's really why we think it's a good model and have a lot to offer to the services and other organizations that want to work with us. And that's all I have. If you have any questions, certainly happy to field whatever I can now, and if not, there's that email address up on the screen.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Alvares. Thank you very much. I want to start off by offering you the opportunity to respond to the earlier question, because I know that you did have some material that you put in the chat. And so is there a map that shows how the AFWERX and Spark Cell type organizations can or already have connected, not just which ones exist?
Let's see. So it's kind of an interesting relationship with AFWERX right now. We've had a series of meetings with Vidoff Diller, the head of AFWERX, as well as the heads of AF Ventures, where we're trying to figure out how we can collaborate more closely. And during the course of those discussions, we've gotten into AFWERX and Spark. There is a lot of great info on their website as to exactly what Spark does, exactly what AF Ventures does, and exactly what Prime does. So a big caveat here is I'm not a member of AFWERX, so this is just my knowledge from having looked into this and having been in discussions with those organizations. But they've recently reorganized to split up into three big components, the ones I just mentioned. Spark, which is focused on sort of the grassroots bringing in of projects to the AFWERX ecosystem. And so if you're at a wing and you see a problem and you want to solve that problem, there might be wing innovation funds, there might be SBIR money that you can tap into to try to solve those problems. AF Ventures is very similar. It's like an Air Force variant of the DIU commercial solutions opening process, except that is entirely SIBR-based, whereas the DIU process is other transactions-based. And then there's prime. So right now there's one prime, Agility Prime, which you may have heard of, which is focused on the electric vertical takeoff and landing market or urban air mobility market. But the intent is for AFWERX to add more primes to the existing primes. So to look at undercapitalized industries in the U.S. that could be critical to national defense, and to look at how the Air Force or AFWERX might be able to infuse capital, not into specific companies necessarily in those industries, but into large swaths of those industries to keep them alive, so we have that capability in the U.S. I know that didn't answer your question directly. I answered it indirectly because that's the only part of it that I actually know. So I realize that might not be a whole lot of help, but it's the best I can do.
No, that's perfect. I just want to give you an opportunity because I know you were involved in the chat. So next question. First, there was a comment on what a great presentation it is, so thank you again. And on slide 6, which of those phases has been the biggest challenge? I would think that the transition phase is difficult because it's there that the project interfaces with traditional acquisition and then sustainment processes.
Sorry, I got to go back to slide 6. Was that the process one?
It does seem as though that would be the one, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. This was my question, and it was on the processes. Basically, of those phases, which would be the most challenging? I mean, my intuition would say that it would be the transition phase, but I'm definitely interested to hear your thoughts.
Kind of, sort of. So, like I said, so transition is absolutely the most difficult phase. I think anybody in DoD acquisitions, whether it's one of the innovation organizations or traditional acquisition, would say that that's the most difficult phase. Like I said, our goal is to front load it and to try to get organizations thinking about transition before we even start a project. And that's such an abstract concept in the DoD. It's just not done. And that's my job. And so I feel like that's pulling teeth most of the time, because you're asking a PEO to say, yes, I will commit to putting in a POM input before we even know if this prototype is going to be successful, right? I guess I can empathize. Like, I understand why they don't want to do that, right? But the consequence of not doing that is that you push your fielding timeline out many, many years, and you get to that average 8-year acquisition time frame, right? So our take is you can always POM now. You don't have to keep that POM input in, but if you don't get that POM input in now you're stuck in this very long acquisition time frame, right? So I think that's absolutely one of the biggest challenges. It's very easy to start projects, and like I'm the guy, and there are a few others at DIU that were the naysayers who say, look, we don't have all the parts and pieces necessary to actually have this be successful. Let's not start this. And I think that's because RDT&E money is so much easier to come by than procurement funding, right? So everybody wants to spend RDT&E money on current year experimentation, but then what's next? And that's the question that's really difficult for people to answer, for organizations to answer. What's next if this experiment is actually successful? Yeah, honestly, the rest of it I think is pretty process intensive and methodological, such that it tends to flow pretty smoothly. It's that transition piece that's so difficult to nail down.
Okay, thank you. Right now we have 4 to 5 additional questions. So I just want to let everyone know, if you do have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. That is what we had dubbed the Q&A, so it's the chat. And also, we have plenty of time. It is around 3:15, and so we have about 45 minutes. So no rush here. All right, next question. How do you transition from prototyping to a program office? That seems to be a major problem area for any and all of our ongoing efforts.
Yeah, so we've seen this go well. We've seen it go not well, just within the realm of DIU projects. And speaking anecdotally here, but from the ones I've seen not go well, it's where we haven't partnered with the PEO and the PM from the outset. And so you think of, let's see, there's an organization in an operational command that has RDT&E money, and they come to DIU and we develop a capability together, and it's just amazing. And then after the end of the prototype period, we go to the PEO and say, hey, can you scale this up? Well, they haven't been in the loop from the outset. So there's, already there's like that cultural foul there of not being inclusive. And then there's just that sense of ownership, like we're asking them to take on our project. It's an uphill battle. So the lesson we learned is that if we're looking at a capability that's going to need to transition to a program of record, and not all do, but if we're looking at one that needs to, we really have to engage the PM and the PEO before we even start thinking about starting a project. So that's certainly one key. I want to jump back to that other comment I just made, though. Not all projects really need to transition to a program of record. I'll give you a couple of examples that we've worked. So one was with Shield AI. So Navy SEAL started this company. He tells the story of when he was a SEAL and he'd be ready to knock down a door, and you don't know what's on the other side of the door. So every time he was wondering, well, this might be the last 30 seconds of my life. He wanted to know what's on the other side of that door. So when he got out of the Navy, he started this company that produced a drone where your special forces team can sit 400 meters off the building. They send this drone out to a building. The drone finds a way in if it can, if there's an open window or door, and then very quickly maps out the inside of the building and takes full motion video the whole time it is doing that mapping using LiDAR, shoots it back to the special forces team. And that capability transitioned incredibly fast and was put into operational use incredibly fast with naval special warfare initially, and now it's spreading across government. That type of project really doesn't need a program of record. Like, we just have a standing production other transaction agreement out there with a dollar cap on it, and anybody that wants to buy X number of these vehicles can MIPR money to DIU for us to send to the company, and then they get the vehicles, right? And then they work. You're probably not going to buy a ton of these, okay? So it's not like something that needs a major logistics tail. And when you do have problems, you'd be able to work them directly with the company. There are other projects we have, like Saildrone, an autonomous small sailing vessel that can travel from San Diego to anywhere in the world with a sensor package on it. So you can imagine the range of use cases. The government never takes ownership of the vehicles in that case. They provide data as a service, I guess. You tell them what sensor package you want or work with them to produce a sensor package, and then contract for their vehicles to be in a part of the world for a certain amount of time. And then the DoD never has to worry about the logistics tail. This is especially attractive to combatant commands that don't have a train and equip mission. They can just get the data they need in real time with current year O&M dollars and not have to worry about anything else. There's another example of small UAS, a series of small UAS or family of small UAS that we facilitated the development of these UAS stemming off of an Army program of record, but we wanted to make these available to the rest of government and the DoD. So we facilitated the companies getting their vehicles onto GSA Advantage for anybody in the DoD and interagency to be able to order. So another instance of not actually having to have a program of record. Long answer to your question, but in instances where we do need to interface, I think the implication in the question was, will you interface with the PEO? And absolutely, we have to do it from day one. But there are also a lot of instances where we just don't need to interface with a program of record or a PEO or PM.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. The next question actually starts with another compliment, a great presentation that you've provided here. How do DoD and R&D organizations tie into your organization?
It's a very timely question. That's a lot of what we're trying to figure out now, and me in particular. As I mentioned, we're trying to just even figure out. So I'm an Air Force person, of course, and we're trying to figure out how we should best interface with just AFWERX. In fact, we have a meeting with Secretary Roper on Monday to talk about exactly that. But there are many more organizations out there. There's Futures Command, there's NavalX, and then there's the RCOs, all the other works is out there. And just 2 days ago, the DIU director was saying, so we had intended to have a summit this past spring to bring all those organizations together, their Silicon Valley office, and talk about this exact question, because we don't have a great methodology to interface, right? That problem of doing projects in a stovepipe is very real, even between the innovation organizations, and so we need to do better. One of the technical solutions we're exploring with AFWERX is to use Salesforce. So AFWERX just adopted Salesforce. DIU did a few years ago, but we really just ramped it up in the last year to be able to share project data. So right now, when DIU thinks about doing a project and it falls into the autonomy portfolio that I represent, one of the first things I do is get on cyber.gov. When we had a Govini account, I used to use that, or I just Google and try to find mass media articles on who else in the DoD might be doing a similar type project. then I pull the names out of the mass media article. I go to whitepages.mil and then cold email whoever that is to try to see what the deal is with their project. That's a really convoluted way to try to connect to other people in the DoD or interagency doing similar things, right? So we need a more routine way, I think, of sharing data. And there is no common database that we know of or we've been able to come across. Even that cyber.gov database is really outdated. I can't find a lot of the AFWERX CIBRs that I know have already been let in the cyber.gov database. And so we're hoping Salesforce will act as at least a stopgap initially between us and AFWERX, and then hopefully we'll be able to add other organizations that are on Salesforce into that same format. And we're not envisioning anything grand, just basic project data, so I can hit a button in my instance of Salesforce and out will pop a report that shows all AFWERX projects, or I can search by keyword or something like that that gives me project name, POC, project description. And that's about really all I need to get started to get the conversation going so we can avoid duplication of effort.
And the next question, are there DoD R&D databases that allow groups to share potential or ongoing R&D efforts across the DoD?
So I think there's probably answered in the last question. The quick answer is no. I'd love for that to exist. My fear is that it won't until it's congressionally mandated, because even with the Salesforce example that I just mentioned, if it's kept small and maybe just DIU and AFWERX, and we keep a personal relationship with the person at AFWERX that's responsible for keeping Salesforce updated, we can probably make that happen, right? But you know how these projects go. As that sort of construct expands, the challenge isn't the technical means to link these databases together. It's will each organization actually maintain their database so that it remains useful information. And I think until there's an above service mandate to do so, it's going to be challenging to make it happen. But I can tell you,
okay, it's something to work towards, right?
Yeah. But without one, we wind up with so much duplication of effort. It can be very frustrating, frankly. There's an egregious one between us and AFWERX, where we wound up contracting with the same company over the same time period with the same capability. It wound up working out in the end, but that's been a driving factor to get us to collaborate more closely to try to avoid those sorts of instances. And I cite that example, but in reality, I know that's happening across the DoD every day, in a wide range of projects. We see some of them from afar, and some of them are a little closer to home.
No, exactly, and it is actually one of the driving factors behind the launch of Innovation Connect. It was precisely to help alleviate some of that as well. So we appreciate you being part of this and supporting that effort. The next question is when are the next CSOs planned to be released?
It's slowed down ever so slightly because of COVID, but typically you'll see about 3 a month, 2 to 3 a month posted on our website. So you see one there almost continuously, given that each one is up for about 2 weeks. But like I said, it's slowed down a little bit because of COVID. It's been great in DIU in terms of working from home. We've been on the G Suite backbone, and so we haven't had much of any disruption to our ability to connect and continue to collaborate. But I know that's not necessarily the case amongst our partner base in the DoD, and probably part of the reason for the slowdown. But yeah, just check our website if you have a desire to be notified. We've gone through kind of a slow website transition where it used to be a lot easier to click a button and get added to our list when new solicitations were posted to get a notification. But for now, if you want to email the questions list or email me, I can manually add you to Salesforce and check the box that says you want to receive notification of new solicitations.
Okay, great. And this question is actually another compliment of your presentation. Great presentation. Aside from the Silicon Valley connection, how does DIU differ from the other OUSD R&D divisions, example RRTO, and DARPA's out there?
Yeah, so the DIU is the only DoD-level organization squarely focused on the commercial sector. So that's one big difference, is that we just don't work with firms that are focused on defense and federal customers, right? For that reason that we don't want the federal government to have to pay for the R&D of the projects or of the solutions that we wind up fielding. And then DARPA typically looks at low TRL technologies. They're looking much further out in the future, what might be needed 10 years down the road, whereas DIU by definition is looking at what we want to get out there as soon as possible, which in our definition is about 2 to 3 years. Taking that one step further, well, I was going to say a TRL, but that's probably the wrong way to say it. We'll look at whatever TRL for a particular technology that can be developed to the point of being ready for production within an 18-month-ish time frame. And I think that's one of the big differences as well between us and the other DoD innovation organizations, or like RRTO or DARPA.
All right, so right now, I'm heading to our last question. I am going to just mention that after Lieutenant Colonel Alvares responds to this, everyone who's online is welcome to unmute. And if you have any other questions that you want to ask while we're online with him and we have his time, please feel free to do so. So let me head into this question, and then we'll open up the line. And if we have no further questions, then we'll close it. All right. It is often said with innovation, fail big and often. Any big DIU failures with one or two key lessons learned that you could share with us, specifically in any enterprise data projects?
This might not be the type of failure that you're thinking of, but in terms of enterprise data, this actually happened slightly just before I got to DIU, so I might not get the details exactly right. But it's referred to in DIU as the RIAN Cloud project, and I'll try to paraphrase this, and again, I apologize if I screw up some of the details, but this was a large cloud IT project with a company called RIAN, and I think there were other vendors as well. I believe Transcom was one of the primary partners. There might have been another unified command, and the prototype was successful. Then we went to production, I believe, with RIAN, and this was the DIU's biggest production contract ever. I want to say it was $800 million. I mentioned during my brief that we've had one GAO protest, and this was it. So Oracle protested. It was an interesting protest in that the parts of the argument, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, was that Oracle claimed that if they knew there was such a big prize at the end of the prototype period, they would have submitted a better prototype. Which I found kind of strange, but the GAO thought that that was appropriate. And so now on every DIU solicitation, there's a disclaimer at the bottom saying that successful prototypes might wind up in very large production contracts. So part of our lesson there, again, I'm not sure that this was necessarily the type of failure that you were thinking of, but our lesson learned was we need to be very careful when we go big on something like this. Like, we need to make sure all our ducks are lined up and everything, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, because it gets a lot of visibility and it attracts the attention of a lot of people inside and outside government. It even led to a change in some legislation that put different approval levels depending on the size of the OT contract. And I think that change in legislation happened in 2018. So now we can do projects, and I'm going to mess up the numbers here, but like under 50 million is just ops normal. I think if we want to go above that, we need maybe the Assistant Secretary of Research and Engineering approval. Up to 500 million, we need another rung of approval, et cetera. But all that came out of that RIAN Cloud project. From a tech perspective, we certainly have had some failures, but in those instances where we've had failures, we've had other vendors in those same contracts, for the most part, that wind up being successful. I think our bigger failures are when we have a very successful prototype project and then no path to transition at the end of that prototype, which, as I hopefully laid out in this presentation, we really work hard to prevent now, having learned those lessons in the past. One really, I don't know, almost sad one, because it's such a compelling technology, is by Zipline. So this is an autonomous distribution aircraft. They made their name by delivering blood and other urgent medical supplies in like sub-Saharan Africa, places where the infant mortality rate was extremely high. They brought those mortality rates down to very low levels by being able to deliver blood to remote areas very rapidly. So it's a fixed-wing aircraft on a launcher that takes off, parachutes down a 5-pound or so package to a lat long somewhere within, I think, about 150-mile radius or so. And the throughput of this vehicle, it's pretty fast. You can have multiple vehicles going at the same time. So you can, if you're an NGO, you can get the zipline system and deliver blood all over the place. So Navy Medical Command sponsored the prototype. And you can kind of see the advantage of this, like being able to get critical supplies out to the battlefield, whether it's blood or small amounts of ammo to a pinned down team or whatever the case is. But unfortunately, there was no follow-on transition. And so this project remains in limbo, looking for a home. And it's examples like that at the end of the day, the prototype was wildly successful. The Marines tested this down in Darwin, Australia. They found a ton of uses for it, but still we don't have a program office or a home for the project. And so at the end of the day, is that really a success? If our mission is to transition capability, we didn't get to that point. And so that's what we try to guard against more than anything these days.
Thank you. I have a question. I had noticed that you have these 5 core areas: AI, autonomy, cyber, human systems, and space. And I was just curious if one sort of, floated to the top as being a priority, or if it's kind of equal across the board. I was just sort of curious on how that was.
I think autonomy and AI got a head start, right? Because of the breadth of customers that those portfolios appeal to. The space has a pretty niche customer base. Human systems is mostly focused on healthcare type stuff, not exclusively, but mostly. What am I missing here? I guess cyber is actually pretty broad, has a pretty broad customer base as well, and starting to do more projects. But I think most of our projects are probably in AI or autonomy right now. So you think of things like counter UAS. Not only is that applicable across the DoD, it's applicable across the interagency. We're working with FBI and all sorts of other organizations that have an interest in counter small UAS. Think of it, every airport in the world needs a counter small UAS capability, especially after the events you've seen, like in Saudi Arabia and England, British airports. Same thing with small UAS and how widely needed those types of capabilities are across the government. Likewise with AI, there's such an overlap between autonomy and AI, but anything where there's data from which you need to be able to pull out correlations that might not be obvious to a human observer or simple Excel type tools, AI probably has a role. And so it's just so widely applicable across such a range of DoD and government functions that tends to be very, very much in demand as well.
Okay, I'm going to make sure I give everyone time if you want to unmute and ask a question. Now at the time, we have a little less than half an hour available to us. If you have a question, feel free to ask now. Okay, and please know that you're always welcome to follow up with us, and we will put you in contact with the right folks. If you decide that you want to ask a question later or you think of something later, feel free to reach out to myself, Ms. King, and if you have the contact information for others, feel free as well. At this point, I'm going to pass it back to our moderator, Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel.
Hey, Colonel Alvares, thanks very much for the presentation. On behalf of Ms. Vadrine and the CDO office, we definitely appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Fascinating presentation, amazing challenges that you guys are up against, and really cool to see a lot of things that you guys have been able to produce. And wish you the best of luck and look forward to partnering with you and supporting you along the way. So thank you very much.
Hey, thanks. Really appreciate it. Again, appreciate the time everybody took to listen. And if you have more questions or want to learn about DIU to a greater extent, diu.mil, please do get in touch with us with any follow-on questions or any projects that you might want to work. Again, thank you.
No, awesome. Thank you, Cramden. Okay, and then just want to remind everyone, thanks again for joining us. Our next event is scheduled for November 12th, so we'll have more information coming out on that, but please mark your calendars. And then this event was recorded, and we're sharing it on our Air Force YouTube page. So, and then just please, if you have any other suggestions for ideas for the future for this event, please let Ms. King or Ms. Mask know. But again, thanks to the team that put this together. Thank you very much, team, and thank you to our guests, and thanks to everyone for attending today. So thank you very much. Have a great Thursday.